Welcome back. Tonight I want to talk about a window that opens every single day of your life, whether you notice it or not. A brief, drowsy stretch of time right before sleep. When the mind grows quiet, the body grows still, and something in you becomes far more receptive than it is during your ordinary waking hours. Neville Goddard called this the state akin to sleep, and he considered it, without exaggeration, the single most powerful tool available for changing the direction of your life. Most people pass through this window every night without ever using it deliberately. They spend it reviewing the day's frustrations, scrolling a screen until their eyes finally give out, or drifting into whatever half-formed worry happened to be loudest that day. And then they wonder, sometimes for years, why their outer life keeps repeating the same patterns, never quite noticing that the most fertile few minutes of their entire day were being handed over, unexamined, to exactly the thoughts they didn't want more of. Tonight, we're going to walk through this properly and completely. What the state akin to sleep actually is, physiologically and beyond that, spiritually. Why this particular drowsy threshold matters so much more than wide-awake effort ever could. How to actually enter it on purpose, step by step, without turning it into a strained performance. What a proper imaginal scene looks like once you're there, and what tends to sabotage it before it can take root. How to know the technique is actually working, long before any outer evidence arrives to confirm it, and how to build this into an ordinary nightly habit, rather than an occasional experiment you try once, and quietly abandon when it doesn't work immediately. This is a long one tonight. Get settled, and let's begin properly. What the state akin to sleep actually is. Start with the phrase itself, because it's precise in a way that's easy to miss on a first hearing. Neville didn't say sleep. He said a state akin to sleep, meaning close to it, bordering it, but distinct from it in an important way. This is the drowsy threshold between full waking awareness and actual unconsciousness, the stretch where your eyes have grown heavy, your thoughts have slowed and softened, and the sharp, argumentative edge of the analytical mind has begun to loosen its grip, but you haven't yet lost awareness entirely. You've almost certainly experienced this state thousands of times without ever naming it. It's the drifting few minutes where a half-formed thought can feel oddly vivid, where an idle daydream can feel more like memory than imagination, where the boundary between what you're picturing and what feels real grows unusually thin. Most people pass through this window entirely passively, letting whatever's on their mind that day simply run unattended. The way a room might sit with a radio playing that nobody's actually listening to closely. Neville taught that this particular state is uniquely valuable because the usual gatekeeper of the mind, the skeptical, questioning, but how would that actually happen? Voice that meets any new idea during ordinary waking hours grows quiet here. More quiet than at almost any other point in your day. In full wakefulness, an unfamiliar assumption about your life gets challenged almost instantly. Evidence gets weighed, objections get raised, the whole apparatus of rational scrutiny goes fully to work testing whether the new idea deserves to be taken seriously at all. In the drowsy threshold just before sleep, that apparatus has largely powered down for the night, its usual vigilance considerably relaxed. An idea entertained here tends to be accepted with far less resistance than it would meet at noon, absorbed rather than interrogated, the way a landscape simply gets absorbed by someone gazing at it quietly, rather than analyzed feature by feature, the way a skeptic might. This is why Neville considered the minutes before sleep so disproportionately valuable, compared to the exact same exercise attempted at, say, midday, in the middle of an ordinary busy afternoon. It isn't that the technique itself changes in any way, it's that the receiving instrument, your own mind, is finally in a condition to actually receive what's being offered to it, rather than immediately arguing with it the moment it arrives. Why the ordinary mind resists change. To understand why this drowsy threshold matters so much, it helps to understand clearly what it's actually bypassing during the rest of your day. During ordinary waking hours, your mind operates with a kind of built-in defense system, largely for genuinely good reason. It compares new information against everything you already believe to be true, and it tends to reject anything that doesn't fit neatly into the existing picture, because maintaining a consistent, coherent sense of reality is, most of the time, a genuinely useful and protective function. You don't actually want to believe every passing thought that crosses your mind during an ordinary day. That would produce its own kind of chaos in your life. But this same protective function becomes a real obstacle the moment you're trying to deliberately shift a long-held assumption about yourself. Tell your fully awake, fully alert mind that you're now someone confident, someone prosperous, someone genuinely at ease, when your lived experience up to this point has suggested otherwise for years, and the defense system activates almost immediately, often within seconds. It produces counter-evidence from memory. It recalls every contradicting instance it can locate. It insists, often quite persuasively, and with considerable detail, that the new idea simply doesn't match the facts already on record. This is precisely why simple daytime affirmation so often fails to produce lasting, durable change, despite being repeated with real sincerity and genuine effort. The words get spoken clearly, but the gatekeeper is standing right there the whole time, fully alert, quietly filing an objection to nearly every claim as it's made, sometimes so quietly you don't even notice the objection happening. The state akin to sleep works precisely because it operates during the one part of your day when that gatekeeper has largely stepped back from its post, allowing something genuinely new to actually be accepted rather than merely recited out loud. The physical signs of the threshold. It helps to know, concretely, what this threshold actually tends to feel like in your own body, because it's genuinely easy to miss if you're not paying attention to the specific signs, and easy to drift past entirely into full sleep before you'd SATS. Tells induces menzier. Tilts. The eyelids typically grow heavy in a particular way that's most different from ordinary tiredness. Not an ache, but a kind of pleasant weight, as though gravity has quietly increased. Thoughts begin to lose their usual crisp, linear structure. A sentence you were forming clearly a few minutes earlier might trail off unfinished, or drift sideways into something only loosely connected. The body tends to feel warmer, heavier, more settled into the mattress than it did even a few minutes before. Sounds from elsewhere in the house or outside may seem to arrive from a slight distance, as though a layer of cotton has been placed gently between you and the ordinary world. None of these signs need to be forced or artificially induced. They arrive on their own, given enough patience and enough genuine relaxation, the same way they would on any ordinary night as you drift towards sleep. The skill being developed here isn't creating this state. It's noticing it as it naturally arrives, and gently directing your attention within it before it deepens further into full unconsciousness, where deliberate direction is no longer possible. Entering the state deliberately here is where the practical work begins, and it's worth walking through carefully and completely, because the effectiveness of this technique depends almost entirely on getting this part right, rather than rushing past it toward the more exciting sounding parts of the practice. Begin by settling into bed at your normal time, in your normal position, without any special ceremony required whatsoever. This isn't about elaborate ritual, candles, specific postures, particular ambient music. Neville was quite clear that ordinary conditions, the same ones you'd use to fall asleep on any other unremarkable night, are entirely sufficient for this practice. What matters is what you do with your attention during the minutes that follow, not the surrounding setup or atmosphere you've arranged. Let your body relax naturally, the way it would on any ordinary night as you drift towards sleep, without any particular agenda. Don't rush this part or try to force drowsiness prematurely through sheer willpower. That tends to create tension rather than ease, which works directly against the very state you're trying to enter in the first place. Simply allow the usual process of settling to happen at its own unhurried pace, paying loose, undemanding attention to the physical sensations of your body growing heavier and more still with each passing minute. As you feel yourself approaching that familiar threshold, heavy-lidded, thoughts slowing considerably, the sharp edges of the day beginning to blur softly around their borders, this is the window you're actually aiming for. Not full wakefulness, where the analytical mind is still fully staffed and alert at its post. Not full sleep, where you'd lose deliberate control entirely and drift into whatever the subconscious happens to generate entirely on its own without your input. Somewhere genuinely in between, drowsy enough that resistance has softened considerably, but awake enough that you can still deliberately direct your attention toward a chosen scene of your own choosing. This window can be genuinely narrow, and it takes real practice to learn to recognize it reliably in your own body, since it feels somewhat different for different people, and even varies noticeably from night to night, depending on how tired you happen to be. Some nights you'll find it easily, almost immediately. Other nights you'll drift past it into sleep before you sleep before you try, or you'll find yourself still too alert and wired to settle into it at all that particular night. Neither outcome is a failure worth criticizing yourself over. It's simply part of learning to recognize a threshold that, by its very nature, isn't sharply or clearly marked with any obvious signal. Choosing the right scene. Once you've settled into that drowsy threshold, the next step is entering a specific imaginal scene, and the actual choice of scene matters considerably more than most people initially assume when they first hear about this practice. The scene should be brief, specific, and should imply that your desire has already been fulfilled, rather than depicting the ongoing process of it being fulfilled somewhere off in the future. This distinction is easy enough to state clearly, and surprisingly easy to get wrong in actual practice. A scene that shows you working towards something, applying, waiting, hoping earnestly, still operates from the underlying position of lack, however positive or optimistic its overall tone might be. A scene that shows you on the other side of the desire entirely, in a small, ordinary moment that could only exist if the thing were already genuinely true, operates from an entirely different position altogether, fulfillment rather than pursuit. Consider the difference between imagining yourself receiving an award in some dramatic ceremony and imagining yourself, afterward, in an ordinary quiet moment where a close friend simply mentions in passing how happy they are for you, and you feel the specific, understated satisfaction of the whole matter being genuinely settled and behind you. The first scene, dramatic as it sounds on paper, actually keeps the achievement at a slight remove. It's still an event to be witnessed from outside, rather than a fact already fully absorbed into ordinary daily life. The second scene, quieter and considerably smaller in scope, implies completion far more effectively, because it treats the achievement as old news rather than as a spectacle. It feels precisely how genuinely settled facts tend to feel once they can become a fully integrated part of your life. Keep the scene genuinely short. A few seconds of authentically felt detail accomplishes considerably more than an elaborate, multi-part story stretched out over many minutes of active construction. In the drowsy state especially, a long, complicated scene tends to demand more analytical effort to sustain properly than the state can comfortably support, which risks pulling you back toward full wakefulness rather than settling you deeper into receptivity. A short scene, replayed gently a handful of times in a row, tends to be far more effective in practice than a long, elaborate one attempted only once. Engaging the senses, not just the sight. One of the more commonly missed details in this practice is the tendency to treat it as a purely visual exercise, picturing a scene the way you might picture a photograph sitting on a shelf, without engaging any of the other senses that would actually be present if the scene were genuinely real and happening to you. Neville was quite specific about this particular point. The imaginal act works best when it involves the senses that would naturally be engaged in the surreal version of that exact moment. Not just what you would see with your eyes, but what you would hear, what you would feel physically against your skin, even what the air itself might feel like in that particular setting. A scene involving a handshake, for instance, should include the actual felt sensation of a hand in yours, not merely the visual image of two hands meeting from some distance away, as though you were watching the whole thing happen to someone else entirely. This matters because sensation, considerably more than mere visual imagery alone, is what convinces the deeper layers of the mind that a given scene is real rather than simply imagined from a distance. Recall, if you can, the last genuinely vivid dream you had. What made it feel so real while it was actually happening was rarely the visual clarity alone. It was the fact that you were fully inside it, feeling it from within rather than watching it unfold from some external vantage point. The imaginal act, done well and thoroughly, aims for exactly that same quality of felt immersion, deliberately and entirely on purpose, rather than accidentally the way an ordinary dream happens to produce it without any conscious direction. So as you enter your chosen scene tonight, don't simply look at it the way you'd glance at a still photograph. Hear the specific words being spoken, in the specific voice of the person speaking them to you. Feel the specific physical sensation genuinely involved, the warmth of the room around you, the texture of whatever object is present, the loosening of tension somewhere in your own chest as relief settles in. The more senses genuinely and deliberately involved in the scene, the more convincingly real it becomes to the part of you that ultimately does the accepting of it as true. An extended example. The phone call. Let me walk through a complete example in full detail, because this technique is far easier to actually use once you can see it applied thoroughly, rather than described only in general, abstract terms. Suppose someone has been waiting on news about a significant opportunity, and the waiting itself has already stretched on for several difficult weeks. As they settle into bed one evening, rather than reviewing the day's uncertainty the way they might on any other ordinary night, they deliberately choose a brief, specific scene, the exact moment of receiving a phone call with the news they've been genuinely hoping for all along. They don't attempt to rehearse the entire conversation from beginning to end, and they don't try to script out every word that might conceivably be said. That would demand far too much active, analytical construction, which works directly against the drowsy receptivity they're actually trying to use here. Instead, they choose just one small, specific moment within that larger imagined scene. The particular relief they'd feel in their own chest the instant they hear the caller's voice shift audibly into warmth. The specific words, "I'm so glad to tell you," and the felt sense of their own shoulders finally dropping, releasing weeks of quietly held tension in a single, unmistakable instant. They enter that specific moment as fully as they genuinely can while in the drowsy state, feeling it directly rather than merely picturing it from some distance away. If their mind wanders, as it naturally and inevitably will from time to time, they don't force themselves back into focus with strain or visible frustration. They simply, gently, return to that same small moment, feeling it once again, letting it settle a little deeper into them each time it's revisited. After a few unhurried minutes, without any particular dramatic effort on their part, they simply drift into actual sleep, the scene fading naturally into unconsciousness, rather than being deliberately clutched and held onto until the very last possible second before sleep takes over. The technique doesn't require that they stay awake long enough to somehow properly finish the scene in full narrative detail. In fact, the natural transition from imaginal scene directly into sleep is considered genuinely ideal, because it means the very last thing the mind engaged with, before consciousness finally handed off entirely to sleep, was the felt reality of fulfillment, rather than the ordinary residue of the day's leftover worries and concerns. Whatever the mind happens to be doing in that final moment right before sleep tends to carry forward into the deeper, less consciously supervised layers of the night ahead, which is precisely the point of deliberately using this particular window rather than any other time of the day available to you. What tends to sabotage the practice? There are a handful of common ways this technique quietly goes wrong in practice, and it's worth naming each of them directly and honestly, because recognizing them clearly in your own attempts is often the entire difference between a technique that seems mysteriously not to work at all and one that simply hasn't yet been given a fair, correctly executed attempt. The first common mistake is trying too hard, straining visibly at the exercise. The drowsy state akin to sleep is, by its very definition, a relaxed state, and straining to force a scene into vivid, crystal clarity through sheer effort tends to pull you directly back toward full alertness rather than settling you deeper into receptivity. If you notice yourself gripping tightly at the scene, working hard to make it feel convincingly real through sheer willpower, that visible effort itself is usually a reliable sign your totality drifted out of the state you're actually trying to use. The correct corrective move here isn't to try even harder. It's to relax further still, and let the scene arrive more gently on its own, rather than being forcefully constructed into place through strain. The second common mistake is choosing a scene that's either too elaborate or too far removed from something you'd find genuinely believable. Even within the safety of your own imagination, A scene that feels wildly implausible, even in the relative freedom of imagination, tends to generate quiet internal resistance underneath the surface, which works directly against the very receptivity the drowsy state is offering you in the first place. It's often considerably more effective to choose a modest, believable scene that clearly implies the desire without requiring an enormous leap of imaginative faith just to enter it, convincingly and without inner argument. The third common mistake is checking in on the technique too anxiously the very next morning, looking immediately and eagerly for outer confirmation, and concluding, when none has visibly arrived yet, that the whole practice has somehow already failed. This fundamentally misunderstands how the entire process actually tends to unfold in real time. The inner shift and the outer confirmation of it rarely arrive on anything resembling the same timeline as each other. Judging the technique by the following morning's unchanged circumstances is a bit like judging whether a seed was planted correctly by digging it back up the very next day just to check on its progress. The checking itself actively disturbs the very process it's trying to honestly evaluate. The fourth mistake, and perhaps the single most common one of all in practice, is simply forgetting to actually do it consistently. The state akin to sleep arrives every single night without exception. Whether or not you choose to use it deliberately, and it's remarkably easy, especially amid the ordinary tiredness of a genuinely long day, to simply drift past it entirely unattended, the same unremarkable way you always have, without thinking twice about it. Building this into a genuine nightly habit, rather than treating it as an occasional experiment reached for only during moments of particular need or crisis, is usually what actually separates people who see real, lasting results over time from people who try it a handful of times and then quietly let the whole practice lapse without noticing. Revision. Using the same state for the day just ending. The state akin to sleep isn't useful for imagining some future desire waiting to be fulfilled. It's equally valuable for revising the day that's just ended, and the two distinct practices work naturally and smoothly together within that same nightly window, one flowing easily into the other. If something happened during the day that left you feeling rattled, disappointed, or embarrassed in some way, the drowsy state right before sleep is a genuinely ideal time to revise it thoroughly, rather than replaying the event exactly as it actually occurred, which is what most people's minds default to doing entirely unprompted and without any conscious choice involved. Deliberately replay it instead the way you genuinely wish it had gone. Hear the calmer, clearer response you wish you'd given in the moment. Feel yourself entirely unaffected by whatever was originally said or done to you. Let the scene resolve itself the way you would have genuinely wanted it to resolve the very first time it happened. This isn't any kind of denial that the original event actually happened. Nothing about this practice of revision claims the underlying physical facts can somehow be altered after the fact through imagination alone. What it genuinely changes is the emotional impression the event leaves behind as you carry it forward into tomorrow, and quite possibly well beyond tomorrow too. An event that lasted only a few minutes in real, physical time can otherwise go on echoing internally for years afterward, simply because it was never once revised, only repeated over and over again in its original, unaltered form each time it happened to cross your mind. Practically speaking, this means your nightly practice within the state akin to sleep can genuinely include both elements together. A brief revision of anything from the day that still needs softening, followed immediately by a brief imaginal scene of a desire already fulfilled. Neither element needs to be lengthy or elaborate. A few unhurried minutes spent on each, done within that same drowsy receptive window, tends to accomplish considerably more in practice than a full hour spent on the same exercises, attempted wide awake in the middle of an ordinary, busy afternoon. How to know it's actually working? Because the outer confirmation of this practice tends to arrive on its own delayed, unpredictable timeline, it genuinely helps to know what the earlier, purely internal signs of progress actually tend to look like, so you're not left waiting anxiously with outer proof as your only available measure of whether anything is happening at stains. The first sign is usually that the chosen scene starts to feel considerably less like a deliberate, effortful exercise and more like an actual memory the more nights you return to it in succession. Early attempts often feel effortful and somewhat awkward, almost performative, the way any genuinely unfamiliar exercise tends to feel at first before it's had time to settle in. With consistent repetition over time, the same scene tends to arrive more easily each time, require noticeably less conscious construction on your part, and start to feel oddly and pleasantly familiar. The way a place you've genuinely visited many times in person feels entirely different from a place you've only ever read about secondhand. The second sign is a subtle but real shift in your daytime mood surrounding the desire in question, noticeable if you're paying attention to it. Where there was once anxious checking, urgent hoping, or a persistent undertone of felt lack running underneath everything, there tends to be, gradually and without much fanfare, a considerably quieter sense of the matter already being settled and resolved. This particular shift often arrives well before any outer evidence does, and it's genuinely worth noticing and trusting when it appears, rather than dismissing it out of hand as mere wishful thinking, simply because nothing external has visibly changed yet in your circumstances. The third sign, often the most quietly encouraging one of all, is that circumstances relevant to your desire start to arrive in small, seemingly unrelated ways that you might have easily overlooked before. A conversation that unexpectedly opens a door you hadn't considered. Information that arrives at precisely the right moment, almost too conveniently. A coincidence that would have seemed entirely unremarkable to you before, but now stands out, clearly as meaningfully connected. These early signs are rarely dramatic or unmistakable in the moment. They're small enough to dismiss entirely if you're not genuinely paying attention, which is exactly why it helps enormously to know well in advance that this is generally what early progress tends to actually look like in practice, rather than waiting indefinitely for something large and completely unmistakable before allowing yourself to trust that anything real is happening at all. Making it an ordinary habit. The single biggest factor separating people who see genuine, lasting results from this technique over time, and people who try it once or twice before quietly abandoning it, isn't talent, isn't raw intensity of feeling, and isn't even the sincerity of the underlying desire itself. It's simple, ordinary consistency, applied without drama or special occasion. Night after night after night, the practice genuinely doesn't need to be treated as some special event, requiring particular focus or extra energy specifically reserved for it. In fact, treating it that way often works directly against long-term consistency, because special events are remarkably easy to skip on a tired night, and tired nights, somewhat ironically, are precisely when the state akin to sleep tends to arrive most naturally and most easily of all. The real goal here is to fold this practice into the ordinary architecture of falling asleep, something you simply do as a normal part of settling in for the night, the same unremarkable way you might already have an existing habit of reading a few pages beforehand or setting an alarm before turning off the light. Over time, this kind of ordinary, unglamorous consistency tends to matter considerably more than any single night's particularly vivid attempt or particularly weak one. Some nights the scene will feel genuinely vivid and come easily to you. Other nights it will feel thin, distracted, and barely present before sleep takes over entirely regardless. Neither individual outcome, on any given night taken alone, determines very much on its own. What actually matters is the accumulated pattern built up across many nights in a row, in much the same way that a single workout rarely changes very much about a person on its own, but a consistent practice, sustained patiently over weeks and months, reliably, predictably does. So here is what I genuinely want to leave you with tonight. Every single night, without a single exception, you pass through a brief window where the usual resistance of the analytical mind grows quiet, and something within you becomes remarkably receptive to whatever it is given during that short stretch of time. Most nights, for most people, that window passes entirely unused, filled instead with whatever ordinary residue the day happened to leave behind, unexamined and unchosen. Tonight, as you settle in for sleep, Let your body relax the way it normally would on any other night, without forcing anything. And as you feel yourself approaching that familiar, heavy-lidded threshold, gently bring to mind one small, specific scene. Not the process of getting what you want, but a brief, entirely ordinary moment that could only exist once the thing you desire is already genuinely yours. Feel it thoroughly, rather than merely picturing it from a distance. Let it be small enough to hold easily in your mind without strain, and let yourself drift naturally from that felt scene directly into sleep, without forcing yourself to remain awake a single moment longer than the state itself naturally allows. Do this not as a special, occasional experiment reserved for difficult moments, but as an ordinary, unremarkable part of how you end each and every day. What you carry into that drowsy threshold tonight has a genuine way of settling in far deeper than anything you could ever accomplish through wide-awake effort during the busy, distracted hours of an ordinary day. The window opens again tomorrow night, and every single night after that, without fail. All that's ever truly been required of you is that you actually walk through it. This has been the Neville Archive. I'll see you in the next one.